Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Thanks everybody for tuning in to Wild Turkey Science. We have Dr. Mike Chamberlain here, who's a name most of you probably already know, but a very well respected scientist in the turkey world, and we're really glad to have you, Mike. Thanks for taking some time to come in and talk to us.
Not a problem. Glad to join you.
Yeah, so we're going to continue our conversations related to the season date frameworks, and we've talked to Mike and a couple of others about this already. And Mike, you've been leading research in so much of the country in the range of turkeys, and you have had your finger on the pulse of what's going on. We really just want to talk through, how the season framework could affect productivity, and then talk about, some of the related factors and even some of the data that I know you've worked on a lot related to why we're even concerned about productivity across states. Sure. As well. I think all of us agree, and we've talked to a couple of others, and I think out there the audience can all agree, if we kill 90+% of gobblers, that's going to be a problem.
No question.
Yeah. So what we wanted to, I guess, start with you is what is the data out there that suggest that there is a problem with different states?
Yeah, sure. So if you look at the data that states collect relative to harvest and production would be like poult per hen ratios. So basically the ratio of young birds to adult or older birds observed in the summer. States use that as a proxy for production. And if you look at those data across the last 20 years, across the southeastern United States and beyond in many other areas, we've seen dramatic declines in production.
So the poults per hen, that's what
yes.
You're talking about?
Yeah. So in many places now, states are reporting less than 2 poults observed per hen on average. And why that's important is we've gone under the assumption for many years that 2 poults per hen is what's required to just maintain a population. And there's some, there's some imprecision there and some things we don't understand, but the fact that we're not producing as many young birds as we did 20 years ago is a problem. You couple that with, in many states, you've seen pretty dramatic declines in harvest. Some of that is, at least more recently, is by design, as states change their harvest regulations to try to reduce harvest in the face of these ongoing declines. But the bottom line is, if you look across the species range, with some exceptions, we're just not making as many birds as we did a few decades ago. And in a lot of areas, we're not harvesting near the number of birds that we have historically. And that, it makes sense. If you're not producing as many, you can't take as many. So, and more recently, you've seen these declines become very problematic well outside of the Southeast. If you look at states like Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska, states that have realized that there are issues there and have or are making changes to hunting season frameworks in those states as well.
Mike, one question that I've had about the the magic number, and I know you said that there's some imprecision there in the 2 poult per hen ratio, but intuitively to me, it takes me a minute to process that, because I'm thinking, this is not a true R selected or K selected species. They're somewhere on the spectrum. They're kind of longish lived, compared to a quail at least. So what are you considering when you think, we have to have 2 poults per hen? Because I'm thinking, if the hen, and this is probably oversimplified coming from the deer world, but I'm thinking if a buck and a doe replace themselves throughout their lifetime, and we repeat that across the landscape, you've got a stable population. Why is that not the same with turkeys?
Well, one thing you see is the survival probabilities of female poults appears to be much lower than male poults.
Okay.
So we see male biased sex ratios in broods to begin with. That starts at the time of basically at the clutch level. You see male biases in sex ratios of eggs.
How biased are we talking here?
About 55-45 based on the last study that was done. Now that was on Rio, so I suspect we'll see some differences in other studies, but that's not really uncommon in the galliform, game bird world to have male biases. So you kind of start out with a male bias, and then, male poults are just hardier. They're bigger, they grow faster proportionally, they're more aggressive. They seek up time brooding under hens as conditions get tough. So there tend to be male biases in broods that survive. So it's when you think 2 poults per hen, it's not always going to translate to a male and a female to begin with. And what we are seeing, which is really problematic in my eyes, is that when we don't understand a lot of what's happening from, say, right now in the turkey world, say, October, September, whatever, in the fall. When we capture birds in the winter, when we capture flocks of hens, we see very, very few juveniles, about 11%. And what that means,
11% of the flock, you mean?
The flock is juveniles. Yep. And if you look back historically, it was often 3-to-1 juvenile to adult. And now we're seeing about 11%. So, so something's happening to these young females throughout this process of, I'm hatched, I'm brooding, I'm making it to the fall, I'm entering a winter flock, and then I'm in this flock with adults in the winter. These females are they're disappearing from the landscape. And what's really interesting, if you look at the genetics data that we have back historically, say early 2000s, there were several studies done out of Karen Mock's lab, and then more recently work we've done here. We think, and it looks pretty compelling, that juvenile females are the dispersers in turkey populations. Unlike, say, in the whitetail world, Will mentioned, these young bucks take off and disperse, but we don't see that jakes are really dispersing that far. Conversely, we're seeing that juvenile females appear to be the ones that are dispersers. And if we're seeing dramatically lower numbers of juvenile females in populations, that may be contributing to some of the issues we're seeing with populations that don't appear to be recovering from, say, 1 or 2 or 3 bad years. And that would also be commensurate with what people tell you, that turkeys have just disappeared from certain parts of the landscape. And if juvenile females are the ones that are supposed to be adding to these populations that are in decline, and these juvenile females are at lower abundance and they're not dispersers, they're not out there to be dispersers, then that could be contributing to some of these issues we're seeing. And it all kind of fits together. These observations that turkeys have just disappeared from certain parts of the landscape, and they don't just reappear. the data kind of flesh out with that this is what could be going on.
Marcus, did your light shut off?
Yeah, lights out.
You aren't moving
lights
enough.
Yeah.
No,
Well-
that definitely makes sense to me. So basically, a poult per hen is not maybe it's related in some way to recruitment, but it's not an actual recruitment number.
Right.
So,
And go ahead, Marcus.
well, I was just going to say with that 10%, I'm thinking about, okay, are we trying to get one hen to replace the mother over her lifetime? On average?
Think about it this way. So if she doesn't replace herself and that juvenile doesn't become an adult on her own, then she really hasn't replaced herself, because we see very little production from juveniles in our populations. Their first year nest, first of all, a lot of juvenile hens don't attempt a nest. Two, they're much less successful than adults, and they're much less successful as brooders if they do hatch.
Yep.
So we really need these females, these hens, to live until they're 2 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're seeing on average, and I'm speaking in generalities across populations from East Texas all the way to North Carolina, but on average, we see in most years about 15 to 20% of our hens are killed or dying. In some populations, we see less than that. And in some populations, we see more than that. But on average, so say 15, 20%. Well, if you think about, if you're producing less and about 80% are making it each year, the law of averages are going to catch up to you after about 4 years, 5 years. And that's kind of what we see based on, we don't recapture hens that were caught 8 or 9 years ago. Every now and then we will, but rarely do we do that.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but just to clarify, what's the probability that a hen, as a juvenile dies before, between that 1 and 2 year mark? Is she more likely to die as that, in that transition, or is it pretty stable 15%?
We don't see a lot of differences in survival once they get to that point. Once they get to be, a fully feathered, functioning first year bird, we don't see dramatic differences in survival between them and, say, a 2+ year old bird.
Okay.
Once they get there, from a survival standpoint, they're essentially an adult.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that from a reproductive standpoint, they're not.
Yep. Okay, so I'm starting to see how that math can work out, and that we have the 10% or 11, I think is what you said, but 11% of the flock is juveniles, and then they still have to make it another year, which is going to chop off another 15% roughly.
Right. And then on average, nest success across the South, at least on our hunted sites, has hovered around 20 to 24% ish on average across about the last decade. So about 80% of all those birds, even when they're 2 years old or older, are not going to hatch a clutch that particular year. So, and Will mentioned this right out of the box, that, turkeys kind of hover on that fence between an R selected species, one you would expect to have very low survival and high reproduction, to a K selected species that would, live a long time and not be as productive. And turkeys kind of ride that fence in a lot of ways. But in this case, they need to live a fairly long time in the face of what we're seeing from a production standpoint in the South. These individual hens are more likely not to be successful each year than are, right? Most nests fail. So this bird needs to live a fairly long time if she is going to replace herself with another female that reaches adulthood and is able to reproduce on her own. Okay. Yeah, for sure.
And then even once those birds get to, 2 years old plus, I feel like I've heard you mention, at least briefly recently, that you're seeing that there's a small number of hens that are potentially producing a disproportionate number of the poults that are recruited. Is that right?
Yes, we've clearly seen that there so for instance, if you look at a sample of hens this year, if they're successful this year, they're very likely to be successful next year as well. If they're not successful this year, they're almost guaranteed to not be successful next year. And the bottom line is that most of the poults that are produced in these populations are produced by a fairly small segment of the hens. And that's not really, I mean, that's not really shocking to me because, you know, turkeys have, the way their populations are structured, they have social hierarchies or dominance hierarchies, and you have some hens that are more fit than others. Presumably the dominant birds, they have access to toms earlier. They have, you know, preferential access to nest sites first. They start nesting and breeding earlier than subdominant birds. So it's not surprising that we've seen that. And actually researchers decades ago saw the same thing, that, you know, that some birds are just better at being successful reproductively than others. And, you know, George Hirsch used to call them, you know, super hens. There's just some hens that are just good at it. And the problem is that most of them are not. So, yeah.
And I think in general, as we start to collect more fine scale data across a variety of wildlife species, for example, there's some emerging data right now with deer that it's the same case with does, that you've got a small number of does that disproportionately are producing the fawns that are recruited into the population. So, I mean, this definitely falls in line with that.
Yeah. And, you know, if you think about it from a kind of a long-term population level standpoint, you should expect to see these lineages, you know, within these populations where the same birds are being represented each, you know, in each generation. There are just some birds that are better, and they're breeders, and there are a lot of birds that are not producing that much for the next generation in that population. And it kind of makes sense, particularly for a bird that has dominance like turkeys do. It does make sense that much of your production would be from a small segment of that population.
So, Mike, along those lines, I saw the paper you recently, just within the last few days, even I saw it online, where you were showing the disproportionate higher success of the early hens versus the late hens. And I think it was 3 or 4 times, but I'm sure you know the numbers much better than I do. When you're talking about the same hen being better, is it that she's consistently each year on the front end of the nesting? Is that what's driving that?
Yes.
Or are you seeing that even independent of that pattern?
Both. It's actually both. Within individual hens, you tend to see fairly strong consistency from one year to the next in regards to timing of onset of laying. Now, there's some, you know, you can see variation, but in general, the early bird gets the worm, and that's a consistent trend within individuals. And what we think, based on observational research from many years ago, is that, you know, dominant hens within these small groups that are breeding with toms, they get access to those toms first. They breed multiple times with those dominant birds, and then they initiate nest first. And we have a paper that's being submitted now where we show this within these social groups in the spring, that the early bird gets the worm. Those first nest within these groups of hens are typically the ones that are more likely to be successful. And therefore, those are the birds that end up producing a lot of the poults that survive. You know, we of course see later nests that hatch, but
so just because I'm not sure if I'm following you perfectly with the hen. I guess when I was thinking about the dominant hen, I was thinking about the old hen. So are you saying that they wouldn't necessarily change dominant structure as they age? Because it sounded like you were also saying as the more dominant ones would be early. So I was thinking maybe they're breeding later when they're young, and then when they get old, they get more dominant and start breeding earlier?
I don't really know the answer to that, Marcus. We have to infer breeding based on, onset of nest initiation. So, and there's some imperfections obviously there, unless you can observe the bird.
Right.
You are just inferring breeding, but
yeah, it's obviously really hard to measure it. But
but we think what's going on based on observational research from decades ago that that it's not always age correlated in regards to dominance.
Yeah. Okay.
Sometimes it's just aggression, it's behavior, it's attitude, it's body size. And toms obviously fight, or they have strife differently than hens do, but hens also do head pecking and wing flogging and these things that they're pretty aggressive towards one another. But the early research showed that if the dominant bird was alive, that the dominance hierarchy didn't change as long as
dominant hen.
Yeah, as long as she was present, then she remained the dominant bird. In her absence, obviously, the hierarchy would kind of break down, and somebody would step up. But so I would just assume through time within these winter flocks of hens that the dominant bird remains the dominant bird until otherwise, either she's lost or something happens to her.
Whereas with males, they're more constantly challenging that hierarchy outside of the reproductive season. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, but Bill Healy's research showed that it was pretty much the same for toms. That if you didn't remove him, he remained the dominant bird. Now, obviously, and y'all have seen this too. If you've turkey hunted, if you've got a clearly dominant bird there, they're not lining up to try to get their tails kicked by him. I mean, they'll challenge him, but it's pretty orderly. Hens. I just watched some birds the other day doing this. I mean, this group of hens, they were constantly bickering with each other. And I think probably what was happening in that case, and then I actually have some students working with us now, is, these fall flocks that we're seeing, those flocks they have some young hens in them. Like we've been talking about, these broods from the summer have now amalgamated into these winter flocks. And these birds may not know each other, because they were hatched down the road 2 miles. So now they've ended up in a flock, and their mom is in that flock, but there's also hens, adults that they don't know. And that's why you're seeing a lot of strife right now, as these hens are kind of jockeying around each other. And this group I watched the other day, there was one hen that she just would not tolerate this other bird. And the other bird looked to me to be, her body size was small. I'm assuming she was a juvenile, but this older bird just would not leave her alone. She just constantly chased her to the point where she wasn't even eating. All she was doing was chasing. You do see that with jakes now too. This time of year, you'll see jakes that are constantly bickering, but you don't see that as much with toms right now. At least I haven't myself. So we think, based on what Watts's work from many years ago and Bill Healy's observational work on captive birds, and we think that if the dominant bird doesn't die or get killed, that things remain fairly orderly. It's when they do die that things kind of break down and get shuffled around.
And I'm kind of switching gears, thinking back to some of the other stuff you were talking about with the hen to poult ratio. So when you were talking about the declines over the past couple of decades, have the states that started earlier in, have you seen that basically stop, where you hit some bottom end, like one poult per hen, or
that's exactly what's happened.
Okay, so it's sort of stabilized at that lower level.
It appears to have, and in some states, Arkansas being one, the last couple of years they've actually seen a slight uptick in production, which is a great sign.
Yeah.
Now whether that will sustain itself and continue to increase, only time will tell. But yes, a lot of the states kind of appeared to bottom out around 1 poult per hen or even less.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you see some annual, year to year variation, but yeah, it does appear that it's stabilized in a lot of states. The problem is it's stabilized at a level that we don't think is sustainable.
Yeah.
Obviously,
if 1 poult per hen is potentially under that stable line, then that's why I was asking, are we even more dire because it just keeps getting worse and worse, or is it actually at least stabilizing at some point? So it was interesting when we were talking to some of the other guys when we looked at the population data over long term from Mississippi and Tennessee. It kind of looked like the population, it went through the restoration phase, I guess, where you had this really fast growth, and then it hit some peak, and then at least in Mississippi, that dropped. I forgot what he said the percentage was. I don't know if you remember, Will, but it sort of stabilized, and it looked really similar to me. And we all noted when we were talking about it, it looked like a carrying capacity curve.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mississippi data, I guess that's been, that peak happened farther back in time. It seems to be kind of fluctuating around that. I know that you had a paper, and it may, if I'm remembering correctly, I think even that poult to hen data you had presented in that paper that was talking about density dependence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that still, I guess, do you still feel the same way about that, where we may be seeing this density dependent pattern in populations that's sort of driving this relationship with populations?
That's a tough topic to tackle. In that paper, we speculated, and this was back in 2015. We speculated that, part of what could be going on across the species range was just that the bird overshot its carrying capacity during restoration, and what we were seeing were these natural, density dependent type relationships. The problem being, and we speculated, and we said it's speculation. We speculated how that maybe could be happening, and we also talked about, the problem, as we saw it, was if density dependence, or at least partially at play, the problem is that our landscapes don't appear capable of supporting the number of birds that we had decades ago. And if that's the case, we're in a real problem, because, from a societal and expectation standpoint, we always want, as many as we can have. And if our landscapes are no longer, capable of supporting the number of birds that we did, then that's a problem, because there's a lot of demand for the supply that we have. And if we can't meet the demand with the supply, then we're going to have to reduce the demand, which is kind of a segue into the harvest regulation discussion, because that's what states are faced with. They're faced with too much demand for the supply, and so they make changes, to try to adjust the demand.
Yeah. Well, I think that was something that Craig talked about that I thought was really interesting, and it seems like it's in line with what you're saying. If we're rapidly increasing, we're in that growth phase still in most states with human populations, and that's just going to put more pressure on, having the supporting infrastructure and everything. And if you think about that carrying capacity, as we take away inhabitable area from turkeys, you're just moving that line down. So if the population is sort of hugging that line, but the line is moving down,
right? Exactly.
Then even if we address current issues with turkeys, we may never return to that level that we were once at.
Yeah, because if there's 50% as much area in a given place for a turkey to inhabit, then theoretically, even if you maintain the same quality, you can only sustain half as many birds. So I guess you could address that by increasing the quality of the habitat, which we talk about plenty, but you're still faced with that broader issue of we're whittling away where turkeys can live, just space wise.
Not only are we seeing loss of habitat, but to your point, we're seeing reductions in quality of the remaining habitat.
Mm-hmm.
And that puts a premium on us as managers to take what is remaining and improve the quality of it as much as possible, because to Will's point, and I don't like to be the pessimist, but I like to refer to myself as a realist in life. And we're not going to go back to the mid 1990s to 2005. We're just not going back there with turkeys. The landscapes that we inhabit are just, one, we've lost habitat, and two, in a lot of ways, we can only impact a certain acreage,
Mm-hmm.
and ergo, we're going to have to try to create ways to take what's left and do the best we can with it as stewards to see if we can stem this decline, and then hopefully maybe increase populations a little or to some degree, knowing we're never going to get back to, to 2000. But if we could get halfway back or whatever, whatever, if we could get a little closer than where we are now, then that would offer states some flexibility that they currently feel like they don't have
Mm-hmm.
in regards to reducing harvest and opportunity.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I think, not to contradict you, but just add a little nuance to the conversation. I mean, I think we can maybe get back to those levels and pockets, right? And I think this is what you're arguing, is that we'll probably never achieve the peak population size at a statewide level, for example, or at a regional level.
Yeah, you're not contradicting me at all, Will. I mean, that I said, at broad spatial scales, at a statewide level, we're not going to go back where we were, but certainly within areas where you have the ability to impact a large footprint of acreage, whether it's private or public lands,
Mm-hmm.
Cooperative type relationships with landowners and agencies. Sure, we could absolutely improve populations in areas to where they're much improved over what they are now.
Right.
We just have to one, incentivize wild turkeys in the vegetative communities they flourish in. We need to incentivize people to create and maintain those plant communities if we're going to be able to reverse what we've seen.
Well, I think even I think that's good for us to flesh out that at the state or regional level, we may not be able to support as many turkey, but at the local level, we could potentially even support more turkeys than we're historically supported in those places. If you have, like you said, enough acreage, enough impact. And I think you've probably worked in several areas like this, Mike. I've been in a few where you have a bunch of landowners or a fairly large land holding that is impacting the turkey populations, and they're just flush with them, even though at the broader scale, maybe state level or whatever, the turkeys may not be doing well, but locally those populations are really flourishing.
I see some shining examples of that scenario. I tend to look at turkey populations kind of from a big picture, and try not to, when I'm asked questions like this, I try intentionally not to let myself go down hey, I saw this really nice 4 properties in central Georgia that have turkeys running everywhere, and they're doing habitat management, they're managing predator communities, their harvest is very conservative, they're doing all the right things, and they have a flourishing, thriving turkey population. I love to see those examples, but I see a lot of decline, at the broader scale at which kind of states manage this bird.
I think I'm with you on that. We're at the broader scale. We need to be thinking about that, especially from all of our perspectives. But I also don't want people to, the listener out there think, well, there's just no point in doing
it's a
anything.
Lost cause. Yeah.
Like you at the local level, you can make a big impact on your local population and potentially have more than you had, you know, in the heyday, so to speak. Especially if you have enough landowners together that are like-minded and you're doing some really good things.
Yeah, I mean, I
it's
think
more,
just reminding folks of that empowers them,
yeah,
to want to make the positive changes that they have within their control.
yeah. And then
Yeah.
if that gets contagious and we have lots of landowners that are all doing it together, then we're just increasing that impact, right? That core can turn into a much larger landscape level pattern, hopefully.
I think we need to, as a kind of a scientific academic management community, we need to figure out ways to better communicate options that landowners have and scenarios that have resulted in the type of that have created the results that group of landowners wanted. Here's what we've done, almost like case examples of,
Exactly.
hey, here's 4 properties out here that did this. This is the path they've taken the last however many years, and this is what their turkey population looks like. See, it's not a lost cause. We can do it. We just have to work together, collectively to do it. And I think if we could identify those scenarios and then really hopefully allow, the landowners would allow you to publicize those scenarios and say, hey, it's really worked here.
Yeah.
It's possible to do this and have more birds than they had 5 or 10 years ago. I think we need to do a little better job of doing that.
Yeah,
but
I think all of us are trying to.
Yeah.
At least all of us in this room are.
But I think one of the things that's super frustrating about that too is I'm sure you guys have seen properties the same way that I have, where a lot of the ingredients are there for a strong turkey population, but the birds aren't there.
Maybe they're isolated by other landowner decisions or something along those lines. Is that what you mean, Will?
Yeah, I mean, as far as root causes, I mean, there's probably as many of those as there are properties out there, but it's not necessarily guaranteed that if you follow this recipe, you're necessarily going to have a strong population. Does it increase the odds? Yes, but it's not a guarantee still.
Yep, and I see examples of that all the time. I go visit properties, and when I get out of the truck, I'm like, wow, this looks really good. And I drive around and the person tells me I haven't seen a turkey in 3 years on this property. And to your point, I have a student that's really interested in this question about permeability of the landscape from a turkey's perspective. And she's really keen on trying to identify combining kind of landscape characteristics and genetics work that we have. Are there some things that we look at and think a turkey could walk? They could just go right through that, or they can navigate through that the bird perceives as being a barrier. And I think, obviously you and I, we look at things like rivers and interstates and things like that, and we think, oh yeah, that's a barrier. But it looks like from a turkey's perspective that they see the landscape much more convoluted than we do, and things that you and I think, well, they could just walk around that. They don't do that. And I think if in her work, if she could tease out, these are characteristics of the landscape that are frustrating dispersal, we might be able to get at, to Will's point, we might be able to start identifying some underlying reasons why these properties that appear to be doing it correctly aren't getting birds. Birds just aren't there. They're not showing up. Well, maybe there are some things that could be addressed in the broader landscape that could help kind of increase the permeability for turkeys so that they would be able to move around a little more freely and disperse and not have these pockets kind of go extinct, if you will, and like to the point, I haven't seen turkey in 3 years, despite the fact that I'm doing the right things. Maybe there's some reasons we could identify from a management perspective to try to address that.
So I know we've kind of veered off discussion of season dates for a minute, but I think justifiably so. That was really good stuff to cover.
Yeah, for sure.
But one of the things that we wanted to get into with that are, if hunt timing and intensity are affecting reproduction, can you talk a little bit about what we would expect the symptoms to be of that? And as you've discussed many times before, I know But what are some of the outcomes that we would expect to see related to that, and data that you and others have collected to show some of those outcomes?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think a little historical background would be helpful for somebody listening to this. So if you look at it from the standpoint of how are turkey seasons set to begin with, in most situations they haven't been based on the biology of the bird to begin with. Many seasons have been set kind of on these historical precedents that, hey, we being us turkey hunters, we want to start hunting when birds are gobbling. We want more. There's turkeys everywhere. And so you saw in many parts of the range, seasons become more liberal, bag limits increase, season opening dates get earlier and earlier as birds, are gobbling earlier than we should be hunting them, which I'll get to. But so you kind of saw this change through time where seasons became more liberal, despite the fact that many, many years ago, the scientific community clearly understood from a biological perspective how seasons needed to be set. And that is wait until a lot of your hens were on the nest, say, half or more, meaning that most of your population had already bred and were starting to become sedentary. They were on nest. At that point, there's some segment of your toms that you can kill because they're expendable. So that's kind of what the science has said for decades. But turkey seasons kind of headed in the other direction, in that instead of kind of focusing on the biology of the bird, which hasn't changed a lot, we kind of focused on our demand, right? And our demand has kind of increased through time. We've wanted to shoot birds. We wanted to hunt when they're vocal, and we've wanted to hunt earlier and earlier. And so you kind of saw this divergence from the science, if you will. And the reasons for that, I think are pretty clear. It's just, turkey hunting has become extremely popular, and over the past few decades, it's become a really passionate hobby for a lot of people. And that's now putting states in a situation where, with the onset of these declines, states are having to kind of go back to the science and say, well, this is how we've thought we should have done it from the start. Now we're going to start moving back, framing the seasons around biology versus not. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lot of what you've seen recently in a number of states.
So, Mike, related to that, when are you saying when at the onset of the first huntings, when they first set, when that has over time kind of moved in a lot of states? Yeah. So you saw the initial seasons were a little bit later than what they were in the most recent decade or two.
Mm-hmm. The kind of the creation of youth hunting opportunities, which often occur, in many areas before the general hunting season. Mm-hmm. But in other situations, it was simply us, contacting politicians and legislators and agencies and saying, hey, I'm hearing a lot of turkeys and I'm not out there mm-hmm. hunting. So I want to be able to go hunt when birds are being vocal. And that's kind of all contributed to this liberalization, if you will, of, mm-hmm. Of the seasons. And states are in a tricky situation because they want us to be happy, because they need us buying licenses and purchasing, mm-hmm. Hunting equipment and generating the economics that run that engine. But they also need enough birds out there, and they need those birds gobbling, and they need the biology to line up with the season so that this resource is sustainable through time, mm-hmm. and we're happy. And that's a tricky balance that they have to dance.
Yeah, for sure. And I think case in point related to that, and this was something that I wasn't even aware of until we spoke to Adam last week. But Marcus, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was saying, and Mike, you're probably already aware of this, but the impetus for the ISBEL paper several years ago that came out of the Southeast Wild Turkey Working Group, wasn't it?
Mhm.
Working group or committee, was prompted by at least one state wanting to expand opportunity for their hunters.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Same.
Yep.
Yeah. And that was what he was kind of reflecting on, is that isn't that long
Right.
ago. And the conversation was about trying to liberalize the season rather than going the other way, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
kind of crazy to think it's changed that much.
Yeah. And I think, in a lot of ways, guys, the increased use of social media and the way that people communicate, good or bad,
Mm-hmm.
has changed so dramatically in the last 5 or 6, 7 years that now things that I think people either were not aware of or they suspected were issues in their own local area or within their state, they're now seeing these other people communicate similar concerns, and you've seen this kind of upwelling, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
of concern about turkeys. And I think we as human beings, we're terrible about this. We tend to, we forget from one year to the next. We just kind of, what happens this year, we sweep it under the rug, and then the next year comes around and we see some issues, but we get through and we sweep it under the rug, and we kind of forget.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the data on this bird across the last 20 years, it is clear that we've had problems.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, from one year to the next, and I'm as guilty as anybody is, from one year to the next, things don't look like they may change that much. But across
Mm-hmm.
20 years,
Mm-hmm.
I look at the data and I'm like, wow, okay, yeah, this is a problem. We need to get our heads around it.
Well, it's interesting something that's not related to turkeys, but there's some cool research about shifting baselines and human perception. And there was a paper that it was about people remembering what things were like when they were a kid versus, what they are now, and how long they're actually going back in time to establish their baseline, so to speak. And it was only like 8 years. Basically, you had this 8-year window where everything you're basing now on to compare to, it was only going back to the baseline at 8 years ago, which, that could be dramatic in a population of a species, right? Like if we had a dramatic decline 30 years ago, but you're only looking at it in 8-year chunks. It was kind of interesting and related to what you're saying.
Think about, and I'm older than either one of you, but I look at my own life and my relationships. So, for instance, expectations. You think about a marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Your expectations in a marriage across. I've been married, over 25 years, and the way that I think and my expectations and my desires and my thoughts and how much you change through time and just a relationship. And you're exactly right. Your benchmark is recent. Your benchmark is not 25 years ago, right? Because you can't even reflect back to what it was like. Like I'm sitting here using a marriage as an example. Well, I can't even remember what it was like to be newlywed.
Mm-hmm.
All I can remember and what I think back to is, okay, what's changed, what's evolved in the last however many years. And you're right, it's not 15 years ago. It's just a handful of years ago. And that's our benchmark. So if our benchmark is more recent, we've forgotten. And from a turkey perspective, I have not. I can distinctly recall hunting on Tallahassee Wildlife Management Area in 1996 in Mississippi. And I can distinctly recall hunting on Delta National Forest in 1993 and hearing turkeys everywhere. Everywhere. And I could take you to either one of those properties now and go to those same places. And at least on one of them, if I heard a bird, I would be happy. And that's, if I had heard one bird the spring of 94 on Delta National Forest, I would have been upset. And if I were to go there now and hear one bird gobble on the roost, I would consider that a good day.
Yeah.
Back in 94, I would have considered it an utter failure. And I can distinctly remember that, thinking, in fact, I remember one day going and not hearing a bird, and I was upset, like physically, mentally upset. And now if I go with my buddies here in Georgia and I don't hear a bird, we go to the store and get a cup of coffee and shoot the breeze and have a biscuit on the way home. And it's just any other day.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
It's the benchmark is 8-10 years ago versus 25.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about, some of the states understanding early on how season frameworks needed to be laid out to work well with the bird's biology, how we deviated from that over time, and then what are some of the impacts you think of those deviations, whether it be increasing bag limits or earlier opening dates? How do those translate into vital rates?
Yeah. So the one thing about spring harvest that's pretty obvious is most of the harvest occurs in the first 2 weeks of the season, no matter when you open the season.
Mm-hmm.
So if the season opens March 15th versus April 1st, most of the birds are killed the first 14 days of the season.
And that's like 70, 75, 80%.
Yeah. In some states, it's really high.
Why
does that matter?
To be clear, 75 or 80% of the total harvest. Season.
Yeah.
Not
the percentage of birds.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that I'm with you. I'm with you.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Most of the birds that are going to be killed that season are killed the first 2 weeks.
Mike, just before you go on, is that similar on private and public land in terms of like what we see for the total harvest? Do you have any?
Yes, if you look at states that have game check systems, whether it's public or private.
Okay.
First couple of weeks of the season, that's when most of the birds that are going to die.
So that's probably explaining why I'm so unsuccessful, is because I'm usually not out in the first 2 weeks. Is that?
Yeah, you need to go when the season opens.
Yeah.
Do you think most of that, Mike, is related to susceptibility of the birds to harvest, or is it just that most hunters concentrate their hunting efforts towards those first couple weeks of the season?
I think it's probably some confounding of both. Obviously you see a lot of activity when the season opens, but you also see that vocal, aggressive birds if they're going to be vocal and be aggressive, they're going to very likely be shot or interact with a hunter. So I think you see some of both. There's just some segment of the toms that are just behaviorally, they're just wired to be more likely to encounter a hunter. And then there's more of us out there that first couple of weeks, and y'all know this, anything in like spring is a time of change. Turkey seasons are opening and fishing's getting better and kids are playing sports, and you have all these competing activities. And the later you get in the season, it's getting warmer. The bugs are coming out, and there's just other things that would divert us from continuing to hunt. Particularly, you see this in a lot of states. If a person bags a bird, then maybe they're less likely to continue to go.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's both, Will. I think it's just an issue with bodies in the woods, and it's an issue with there's some of these birds that are just more likely to be harvested.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
And to your question, what are some potential impacts, of the timing and the rate of harvest? And that's really that's really what matters. It's the timing of the harvest and the rate at which we're harvesting the birds. And what I mean by that is the percentage of toms that we remove. Those two things are interacting with each other. So research many years ago suggested that the rate needed to be about 30% and no higher, meaning about 30% of your toms could be removed each year. But that was predicated on two things. One, production was about 3 times higher then than it is now. And two, the assumption was that 30% would occur after peaks in nest incubation. In other words, when about half of your hens were on the nest, then you could start removing this 30%. And the assumption there was that at that point, that 30% was expendable, right? They had already bred, so you could cut that 30% out, and then the birds that were being produced that summer would refill, would backfill, and you would have this constant production that was producing jakes, and those jakes would live to be toms, and this cycle was repeatable. In that research that was used to generate those recommendations, there were a couple of assumptions. One assumption was if you violate this and you remove toms too early, you could see changes to reproduction because there would be a lack of dominant birds that would be breeding. And what you would expect to see is some hens would not nest, and the timing of reproduction would be slowed down. In other words, it would take a little longer because you were removing, some toms early, and you were disrupting the breeding process. That was one assumption that said, don't violate this assumption. If you do, then you could see changes to reproduction. And the other was, don't go over the 30%. Don't kill more than 30%. And if you look across the last decade, in not just my own research, but in a lot of states that have looked at harvest rates, we see rates, particularly on public lands, that often exceed, and sometimes by quite a bit, the 30%. Understanding that we're not producing the number of birds that would sustain the 30%. Mm-hmm. So that 30%, I strongly believe, is no longer valid in much of the landscape because we're not producing the number of birds that was used to create those recommendations. And in many, what we'll talk about the South here, in many states until very recently, the season opened well before peaks in nest incubation. What we've seen across from North Carolina, South Carolina, all the way over to East Texas, the peaks in nest incubation are on or around April 15th. And if you just look at the opening dates of many seasons in the South, they're well before April 15th. And we don't see a dramatic amount of variation from one year to the next in that timing of that nesting. We see some. I posted about this recently on social media. About every 5 years, we see that nesting is a little later than average, but we don't see that it's earlier than average, if that makes sense. There are some things that can delay reproduction, like really poor mass crops in the winter that will delay nesting in the spring, but there are not corresponding things that would speed up nesting, such as, a little bit warmer spring. Again, we see some variation, but if you look across a decade, on average, it's about April 15th, which means that laying is starting the first week of April, right? So they're starting to lay those clutches that they start incubating mid-April. They're laying them around April 2nd-ish, April 3rd-ish on average. And that's kind of what the data suggests.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the seasons, I guess, are starting in March. So that's before even the laying. And are we seeing corresponding changes in the season date so that it's approaching laying? Or are there some that are going even farther?
Yeah, you're seeing both. In that, in the Isabel paper you mentioned, they recommended two different possible scenarios. One was the most conservative would be timing with the peaks in nest incubation. Mm-hmm. The less conservative, but still biologically relevant scenario would be at least delay it until the peaks in laying are occurring, mm-hmm. which again would be that, across much of the South would be early April. So what you've seen some states take is the approach. Here's an example. South Carolina took the approach where they They moved their season to the 1st of April, but then they created a scenario where each hunter can only harvest one bird within the first week or so of the season. And what they're trying to do is allow opportunity, but minimize that kill, try to reduce that kill, that first week of April. Missouri took the same approach. And then you see some states like, say, Georgia recently took the approach of just delaying the season entirely statewide for a couple of weeks to get around that first week of April. So you're seeing states take a variety of approaches. Alabama, they delayed their season a little bit and then changed some of the tools and technology that could be used. They prohibited the use of decoys. Louisiana has made a number of changes where they would move it a week later, and then maybe a week later. Arkansas has done the same thing. Arkansas took a very aggressive approach where they not only delayed their season opener, but they also reduced their bag limit and they prohibited the harvest of jakes and bearded hens. So you kind of see a gambit of options being used by states, and unfortunately that's a contentious topic because you and I, we want to hunt, and to your point, if your expectation is based on 5-6 years ago and you were allowed to hunt in mid-March and kill 3 birds, and now this state's telling you have to wait until the 1st of April and you can only kill 2 birds. Well, that some people understand that and some people get upset about that. And I understand it because I want to be out there hunting just like you do. And if I can't, and I don't have the opportunity that I once had, then I'm not happy about that. But I hope that hunters collectively will understand why states are making these changes, and they're controlling the one thing they can control at a broad spatial scale, which is statewide. They're not looking at your land or your neighbor's land.
Right.
They're looking across the state, and they're saying we can control harvest at a statewide level, which is what they manage the bird at. So that's what we're going to change. And that creates the crankiness, if you will, amongst hunters. And I get it. I see both sides of this because I'm a hunter. I was a turkey hunter before I was a scientist, and I still am.
Well, at least after about 8 or 10 years, we should shift that baseline.
I don't think it'll take that long. Honestly,
yeah.
These things have such a short time window that the shelf life on these problems, if you will, the problem with the population is not a short shelf life. We have much work to do, but you make changes to regulations and agency staff will tell you this. After a year, people quit complaining about it. They move on to other things. They
complain about something else.
They complain about something else. And I'll do the same thing. Something changes in your life and you get mad about it, or you get upset about it, and you fret on it, and then you have to move on because you have other things to worry about in life. And I think, these regulations changes are going to be like that. And I just hope, and I do hope, and I pray that they are going to matter, because we need to right the ship in a lot of areas. And if changing how many I kill and when I do it can help, then I'm willing to do it. And I hope that it translates to the changes that we want to see.
And if it does start to help, what are the mechanisms that you propose that it would make those positive changes through?
Yeah, so I'll predicate this answer on there's a couple things I think we need to keep in mind as we go through this process. One, we are not going to see changes at a statewide level in a year or 2 years or 3 years. And it's not going to be we make a change and then next year we see 3.5 poults per hen. That's just not going to happen. So I have work on some sites here in Georgia where there have been tweaks to the regulations and things haven't changed much at all. Now we're in the first year of a statewide change, which I think is what it's taking. But, if you look at, say, Arkansas, they made these very dramatic changes, and you have seen upticks in poult per hen ratios the last couple of years. I think if we're going to see an impact, that's what we're going to see. We're going to see these trends kind of reverse themselves slightly. You're going to see that harvest doesn't continue to decline, that it's going to start at least maintaining itself or increasing slightly, unless, of course, the regulations continue to change and they reduce bag limits and they reduce opportunity. And you should see an uptick in production. And I kind of look at our hunted populations and compare them to we've been studying turkeys on a non-hunted population in South Carolina. Yeah, this is a couple 100,000 acres that birds are not hunted on, and parts of that property have been hunted basically 2 days a year, but much of the property has never been hunted for decades. And what we see on that property, just for comparative purposes, the timing of reproduction is no different than our hunted populations. The onset of nesting is at the same time. And that's where the populations differ. We see almost twofold higher nest success on the non-hunted population. Same landscape, pine-dominated forest.
So around 50%?
No, we're seeing like 18 to 22% on our hunted and 35 to 40% on our non-hunted. So not quite twofold, but much higher.
And still way better than the average across the Southeast right now.
Yes, by far. We see higher renesting rates, meaning if the first clutch is lost, we see higher renesting rates on the non-hunted population. We're seeing better brood survival on the non-hunted population, and we're seeing larger brood sizes at the end of the first month of life, meaning that these broods have more surviving poults in them at the end of that month. We're seeing that the timing of the nesting season is truncated on the non-hunted population. What I mean by that is, on our hunted populations, you see this dramatic uptick in nesting and this slow decline through the summer, where a lot of birds are still trying in May and June and even into early July. We don't see that in the non-hunted population. You see this bell curve where there's a huge uptick in nesting. Almost everybody's on the nest at the same time, and then it declines, and by June, it's pretty much over with. And that's the way it should look, because there's this big pulse of reproduction. Everybody's doing it at the same time, and then it's over with. And we see our gobbling data looks the same way. On our hunted sites, you see this really dramatic uptick in March. Birds are gobbling like crazy. And then on public sites, they're heavily hunted. You see this precipitous decline when hunting starts. And as you know, on your private sites, you may not see that dramatic decline. It might, but it still declines. It's just not as dramatic. Mm-hmm. But you start seeing birds are taken, and you see this kind of slow decline. We don't see that on the non-hunted population. We see a dramatic increase in gobbling. It peaks and then it declines, and it's over with.
So just to make sure, because I wanted to intuitively, for me, when you were talking earlier, when you say the intensive harvest would delay a hen, I guess what you would see at the population level, I was thinking if you fix that, then you would see the nesting move earlier. But you're saying that the mean nesting time wouldn't necessarily move. Yeah, it stays the same, but what you've done is change the shape of the bell-shaped curve, so to speak.
Right. And like we were talking about earlier, the earlier segment of that bell curve is the most successful.
So you sort of have a bell-shaped curve roughly when you have no hunting. But what happens is if you grab the right end of that bell-shaped curve and start stretching it out.
That's exactly perfect analogy. Okay. Grab the right end of that curve and pull it out farther to the right. Yeah,
where you don't really change the left side of the curve, you're just changing the right side and potentially moving the peak down.
Yep, that's correct. Exactly. So if you pull the figure out to the right, you pull the peak down. Mm-hmm. And therefore the proportion that's in that early segment is not the same.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So that matters, at a population level, that matters. And so I think to Will's earlier question, which is a really good question, is okay, so what could happen as states make these changes? What should we expect if we're going to see anything? I think probably what we'll see, I hope what we'll see is that our hunted populations, those figures are going to become more similar to parts of the figures in our non-hunted populations, whether it be a little bit better production, a little higher nest success, a little bit better brood success, more juveniles being recruited into the fall. The timing doesn't change that much. Turkeys are still nesting when they're supposed to be nesting, but we're not disrupting the process in a way to where we're getting a big slug of nest early like we should. And we're not drawing that curve out to the right to where it's over in June when it's supposed to be over. And people ask me a lot, well, why does the timing, like, why is it early bird gets the worm? And if you think about it from a turkey's perspective, being hatched in May, the first weekend of May, is a lot better than being hatched the first weekend of June. If you walk around the woods in May versus June, what do you notice? You notice the vegetation is more succulent in May than it is in June. You notice that it's cooler than May the 1st than June the 1st. And turkeys, when they're young, they can't thermoregulate. So they have to go find areas that are optimal for their temperature gradients. And as vegetation becomes less succulent as the summer drags on, insect populations change, and turkeys have to eat almost all insects the first few weeks because they're molting and they're growing really fast. So it makes complete sense to want to hatch earlier versus later. And what you also see is, which I think gets lost, in the turkey world, if you're hatched in May versus your compadre that's hatched in June, you are larger than that bird in August. And if you're larger than that bird in August, very likely you're going to be socially dominant to that bird in August. And I was talking with, I don't know if y'all know Tess Jolly, but she's a photographer, wonderful woman. And she's been watching a group of broods lately that have gotten together in these big, with 4 or 5 hens and like 25 poults. And what she was telling me, and she sent me some pictures of this, it's really cool. You've got these, you've got some poults that are much bigger than the other poults because they were hatched a month earlier. And she's seeing this play out from her, her blind where she photographs, is those larger poults not only are socially dominant to those smaller poults, but they displace them. They, you move away from me. And what that does is it puts these younger poults that are hatched later in areas that are not as optimal brood habitat. And that's one of the things I see as the most, if it is the thing I see as the most limited on average, the places I go is quality brood habitat. So if you've got some birds that are hatching later, you think, well, that's a great thing. And I'm not saying it's not, I'm just saying I'd much rather that bird be hatched earlier than later.
I think that's one thing that might be confusing with people when at least when I talk to them. I agree with you the same. When I go just about anywhere, brooding is what, like, that cover is absent or poor. But one thing that I hear all the time, and I know that you do, people just immediately assume that when you're talking about thermoregulation, that cold is what's going to kill instead of heat. And I think that's one thing that's not very intuitive, and I just wanted to speak to directly while we have people's ear right now. Hopefully, all 3 of our listeners are on the edge of their seat right now.
And the data show this, Marcus, very clearly. As our data from our GPS marked broods very clearly shows that they go to cooler areas on the landscape.
Yeah. And I know you had a paper that just recently came out showing that thermal landscape stuff, and it was as I recall, it's heat that was really limiting on the landscape, like the being too hot.
Yeah, that's right. And that's because, these broods, as they age, it's the time of year where it's really getting hot during the middle of the day. And they seek out these cooler areas where they can also forage and loaf. And in these pine dominated landscapes, those areas are most of the time hardwood areas, either upland or bottomland hardwood areas, or there are areas around openings where air is moving. And if you look at the landscape, and we've actually done a little bit of this where we started predicting out what percentage of the landscape on some of our study sites would be an area where one of these broods would go. It was like 3 or 4%. I mean, it's tiny percentages of the landscape.
Well, I think when we talked to Craig, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
No.
he was saying the same thing. Just it was single digits when you added up all the nesting and brooding, if I recall, Will. And then the South Carolina study was similar.
Yeah, single digit proportion of the landscape driving the majority of resource selection.
Yeah, it sounds like your data shows similar, Mike.
Yeah, mostly from a brooding perspective. We see nesting in a lot of areas. We see turkeys nest in a lot of areas. Not saying it's not limited. I'm just saying it's much broader, much broader than what they brood in. And I really think that's one of our major bottlenecks in our population is just quality brood habitat, and quality being not that they'll use it, but they'll survive while using it. Just them being there is not, oh, I saw a turkey there, that's good stuff. If they don't live, it's not. And to live, you have to be able to eat a lot of bugs, grow fast, and avoid predation. That's quality brood habitat. We don't have enough of it for sure.
Yeah, I think all of us say that just over and over and over and over again. And a lot of people are trying to correct that on their own property, but I see it as a way at the local level that a lot of people can increase productivity relatively easily compared to some of the other levers they could pull, is increasing the amount of brood, high quality brooding area on the property.
And I think to some degree, some of the people, and you may not have seen this, Marcus or Will, but a lot of people that I talk with, and I may go to their property, and this topic comes up, and they start asking me, well, okay, well, what does it look like? What is that good? They point over, and I'm like, no, that's way too thick. And you start describing to them what it takes to make good brood cover. It's much more open. It takes more management. It's a little heavier handed, than they're doing. And we've actually gone into these areas where these GPS marked broods have used, and we've taken GoPros in there and videoed what it looked like. And when you look at it, you realize that, okay, it's going to take something. You got to do something for a brood to be there, whether it's burning or disking or whatever, timber harvest, something created this vegetation community. And I'm actually in the process of I've got a developer developing a website, and we're going to put those GoPro videos on there awesome. Just so people can kind of see, this is what it looks like. This is actually, a brood was here and they survived. Yeah. This is what she used across the 28 days that she had this brood that lived. And what you see is it is diverse. As the poults get bigger, they use more different types of places. But man, that first week or so, it's pretty specific. And that first week or so is the money. And I hope people will be able to look at that and say, okay, now I get it. Yeah. Okay, now I get it. I thought it looked like this, but it really looks like that. And I can do that. Yeah. I can produce that. I needed to see it.
It also, I've run into this. I want to be able to show them on the ground when I get on their property, but they don't have any for me to show.
Can't find it. Yeah,
right. It's not there.
Yeah.
And I see the same thing. I just, literally in the last couple of days, spent time with somebody trying to walk them through that process, and with a lot of fields that their intent is to make it into brood fields. And, we get out there in them and they're chock full of crabgrass and goosegrass and And, more broadly, there's all sorts of mat forming grasses that we talk about. And that's all, this big, thick mess in these fields that they're trying to do it. And a lot of times their strategy was just to quit mowing the field.
Right. Right.
In and of itself, is better than mowing it probably, but they're not getting there to this open ground, at the ground level, that stuff that you're talking about. And a lot of times it took them a long time to get the field into that shape, and then they're trying to immediately get out of it. And when you have a history of stockpiling, ryegrass and crabgrass and all the other stuff, that's cluttering it up, it might take you a little.
Take some time, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was an important point that Mike brought up earlier, and Marcus, you just reiterated, is that we need to be, trying to create these ideal conditions for broods, and that isn't necessarily reflected in the areas that we see broods using on the current landscape. For example, if you're seeing broods out in a Bermuda grass pasture, that's far from ideal based on what they need, but maybe it's as close to the ideal as they have available to them in that landscape. So,
exactly.
don't conflate use with increasing survival probability.
Well, and the other thing is those broods are often older. So
that's true too.
When in that critical 2 weeks that Mike was talking about, you probably weren't seeing them out in that.
Exactly. Yeah. Because the first 2 weeks, we don't often see, I don't personally often see broods that are that young. I mean, in our case, we do, because we have GPS units on the hens, so, and we're often trying to figure out if they're still alive or not. But you don't often see broods until they're at least, 14 days old, and often a month old, when they're really traveling with mom and they're half her size, ish, chicken size. That's when we usually see them. And by that point, they've already run the gauntlet to make that first few weeks. Well, and we have no idea what they were using.
Even if you're seeing the hens, if they're 3 or 4 inches tall, they're probably hidden all around in the vegetation she's standing in. So, Mike, when I'm kind of circling back around to these season dates, it sounds like one of the things that I kind of naively was expecting was if season dates and intensity and timing and all that is a problem, if we fix that problem, we might see nesting move forward in time. So that was one thing that I was kind of thinking about incorrectly. But the other thing I was trying to put together several of the things that you're talking about in my head and think about how it influenced productivity. Are there other factors that are associated here? Like it sounded like you said, even the early nesting hens themselves might be influenced, like their productivity and how many poults they produce, and then how many make it on those early ones that do time it right. Is there something else at play in that that whole scenario that is influencing the success of it?
No. Yeah. I think in a lot of ways, there's just so much we don't understand about how our activities in general affect not just turkeys, but a lot of hunted species. I think, to your point, I don't want to suggest that there would be no changes to nesting. I think back to our curve, if we could push, instead of stretching the right side of that bell curve out, if we could push it back a little bit and get a good segment of our hens in the laying sequence or on the nest before we started removing toms, then that would more mimic the early nesting period on, non-hunted sites. So I think you would see productivity from that segment of the birds increase. I think
that I understand that part mechanistically, that if there's a problem just inherent to nesting later and we kind of pull that tail in. But I was wondering, okay, well, is there another mechanism at play that could be happening with the ones that stayed the ones that were already early nesting, is there anything else that's happening that would affect their productivity, or is the productivity all in your mind linked to that tail being strung out? I realize the majority of it may be, but I don't know if
think
I'm
also,
articulating my question well.
yeah, I think some of it is just, access, unfettered access to breeding toms.
Okay.
And I think that I don't think there's any question based on the data that I have that we are disrupting breeding in this bird. As soon as hunting starts, things slow down. It's very clear that nesting slows down, gobbling declines. It's just the magnitude of that change that you see from one part of the landscape to the other. In some places, it's very dramatic, and in other places, it's not as dramatic. Mm-hmm. But it's still there. The signal is still there. So I think there's a lot we don't understand about how is that disruption occurring. It's not just killing toms, because if you look at the gobbling data, for instance, we're not killing all the toms.
Right.
So, there's a lot of birds still out there. It's just that they're behaving differently once they've been hunted.
Well,
does that matter? Yeah, I think it probably does. I think there are these more subtle things, whether it's, disturbance from us, whether it's interactions with people or other birds, whether it's, hey, I kind of got disrupted here and I don't have access to that tom anymore, so I'm going to go search for another one. That slows things down. That requires me to burn some more resources. Maybe when I start laying, I'm not in the exact same physiological condition that I was 2 weeks earlier. You see, I think those things could be much more subtle. And frankly, we may never detect those. We may never be able to get that signal out.
And I was thinking about some other things. So like presumably all this mating behavior is predicated on it being a signal, the male to the female of the quality of the male. And I'm just wondering, as part of, like, if you're expecting nesting success or whatever to increase, could that be related to female selection of a mate, like in terms of its quality? Because why would that a parent, the male is advertising its health or whatever,
right? His fitness.
So I'm just thinking about, okay, if we take the dominant male out, then the breeding ends up, it could potentially be with a
subdominant bird,
bird that's less fit. But the other thing is, I guess, is there something about the being able to copulate with the same one over and over again? It seemed like you might have been even indicating, and I'm sorry, I'm really weak on this biology part of it because that's not what I do generally, but
multiple breedings matters.
So basically there's like a sperm load or something that she's able to carry, and that could matter as well.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, because so turkeys are adapted to copulate multiple times, whether it's with the same with the same tom or multiple toms. And the reason is she starts becoming receptive and she will copulate, but the viability of that sperm, as she stores it, and once she stores it, the viability starts to decline. So it behooves her, if you think about it from a fitness perspective, to copulate several times and then allow the sperm, there's competition at the sperm level. When her body, through these tubules, releases the sperm to start fertilizing her clutch, the best sperm wins. And the best sperm may not just be from who it came from, but when it was deposited.
Yeah.
So the timing of that matters, which is why, and this is another thing kind of states are using, as part of their logic here, that if you're disrupting the access of hens to those dominant birds that they want to copulate with repeatedly because that's the best tom, if you're disrupting that, then it makes sense that she would slow down. Sexual selection a species that looks like a wild turkey, they're gaudy, they're obnoxious, they're aggressive. That's strong sexual selection.
Yeah.
And it's nonsensical to think that in a species that uses these elaborate displays like this, that one tom is just as good as another one. That's just not the way it works. There are dominant birds, and they are more fit. That's why they're dominant. They're more iridescent. They have lower parasite loads. They're more aggressive. They're often larger, and she should want to mate with the best bird that she has access to, because that confers her clutch more fitness. So if she can't, if he disappears, or if the process is kind of slowed down just because he's disturbed or he's disrupted, then it should slow her down, because she wants to breed with the best toms that are out there, and a subordinate bird is not the best tom. Ergo, she wants to find those dominant birds, which we think is part of why that curve gets pulled out. We think, in our hunted populations,
it's just like a mate limitation searching for So would you also expect that to affect like hatchability? I'm just trying to think,
Yes, it could, because if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, more fit birds should be more likely to produce successful clutches, and then should also produce poults that are more successful. That's part of the whole process here. So
although from a natural selection standpoint, just for the audience, that doesn't necessarily have to be some gaudy difference in the success. Like if this is
could be very subtle.
if it's operating over a long time period, it could be just a slight advantage and still be selected for. So,
and if you look, there's literature showing this. If whether it be the delay in reproduction, research on species like prairie chickens that that have gone in, and researchers have intentionally disrupted the breeding process to see what would happen. Just by going in and kind of disrupting the selection, the mate selection process, slowed everything down. It caused the hens to just say, okay, hold up. I don't have access to that tom or in that case, the rooster that I had access to. So I'm going to slow down and make sure I evaluate these males again and pick the best one that I can find. And so it did. It at least in the prairie chicken study, it drew that tail out, just like we're seeing in our hunted populations. And we think what we've just discussed is part of that, is that process.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to think about, we're moving dates, and I'm just saying the royal we, like different states are making those decisions, and we don't necessarily want to be 20 years down the road trying to figure out if it worked. I'm trying to think of what are going to be some indicators that we're all as scientists could be tracking, and what would we expect to be indicators that we're actually having the desired effect, and that there's not something else that we need to do, which there probably are multiple things. But, I guess I'm trying to think about what are those indicators, how would they change, what would be the magnitude we might change. I think those are sounds like some of the uncertainties. We're not sure exactly what time frame and what magnitude necessarily, or even necessarily which mechanisms are most important. But I'm just trying to think through, what do we need to measure to evaluate so that we can feed that back into this, a more adaptive framework, and know where to go.
Yeah. I think we just, the studies that we have ongoing as states are making changes where we can see, I would expect through time that you would see that these populations would start changing in regards to some of these vital rates we've talked about, whether it's, the timing of nest initiation, or the duration of the nesting season, or the success of nest, the renesting rates, these things that we can track. I would predict that they would improve through time, but it is not going to happen in a year.
Yeah. And
I think, if you look at other things that influence turkey populations reproductively, one big one is the mass crop in the South. That's a big one. You get a really poor mass crop, and you can see this clearly in every study that's been done. That spring is tough. That's a tough spring.
Mm-hmm.
The hens are down on body condition. The nesting is delayed slightly. You see some hens that do not attempt to renest. In fact, a lot of them don't, because they're just not physiologically capable of doing it.
Yeah, and if
So
that,
you kind of,
I'm sorry, if that aligns with
oh,
poor conditions environmentally, on top of that, it probably just makes it even worse, right?
yeah. So you may end up seeing that, you make a regs change, and then 2 years in, you get a really bad winter coupled with a really wet spring, or
Mhm.
these kind of perfect storms, and you end up seeing that production and all these vital rates we're measuring are worse,
Mhm.
or and then the naysayers, of course, see, it doesn't matter. Well, you're going to have to look at this across 3-5 years
Yeah.
plus, because this didn't happen overnight.
Mhm.
This is this is taking
Yes.
years to get to where we are, and it's going to take us years to get out.
Well, I think
Um,
the other thing, and we've tried to reiterate this over and over again, there is so much variation from year to year, and I don't even know how many times we've said this, Will, already on the podcast, but there's been a whole bunch of them, that the populations and the vital rates are varying, even if nothing changes, except for the year to you just go year to year and have
mhm,
this huge
mhm,
swing in these metrics. But it's also important for when we've been talking about study design and everything, having areas where things change and where they didn't change, so that you have these intrinsic parts, or this extrinsic part of this story, that you can capture when you have that kind of study design. I think that's what your discussion is pointing out. This similar to when we were talking, Will and I have talked a lot about predator related studies and the importance of having paired things where you change something and don't change it in the other one,
mhm.
to try to help smooth out some of this uncertainty that's just from year to year. So
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
uh, the other thing, I didn't want to forget it, and it's kind of, I know we're bouncing all around, but I think it's really interesting conversation related to the pulse size. I just got a message a few days ago from somebody that was talking. They were showing me pictures from August, and they had little bitty poults,
Hmm.
and yeah, they were basically. I don't remember what the line of questioning was, but I remember I was indicating to them that they probably aren't going to fare well. So when you were talking about the poults being mismatched in size when they kind of all come together, another question that we didn't get to that occurred to me that is an interesting thing to discuss is that when you have all that group of hens that come together and they have different age poults, I think you already covered really well that the big poults are going to be better at catching bugs or whatever than the little poults. But who's going to drive where they brood? Are they going to brood in a different place because there's an older set of poults in there, or are the younger poults going to get rain over? Like, is somebody's mother going to take over the reins? Do you understand what I'm trying to
Yeah,
ask you?
yeah.
I'm
I mean,
not
from a
articulate.
social standpoint, once they get that age where these older poults are juveniles, they're molting, they're beginning to look like adults, but they're half the they're
Mm-hmm.
half the size of mom or a little larger. In those cases, that they're functioning as a flock. So there's you've got adult hens that are kind of driving the ship in regards to where we go.
Mm-hmm.
But then once they get there, it's a kind of a collective,
Yeah,
and you see this, you kind of see the
the
birds are,
competition part. So
yeah,
yeah,
they're,
I was just wondering. Okay, we got this. Well, when you were talking about you got a 7-day old poult that has a very specific set of conditions that is not common to the month-old poult. So I'm wondering, okay, if we've got both of those in a group, are we going to go to the place that the older poults are going to do fine, but they're
absolutely, yeah,
so it's
because
not just
the older poults,
competition, like when they get there, it's also like where
right?
they're selecting it. I think that's really
Yeah, and if you
interesting. I've
think
never thought
if
about
you
that.
think about it from the standpoint of, if you look at a graph, I posted about this recently because it was about this topic.
Mhm.
Somebody had asked me about this. If you look at the timing of hatch, and then you plot out the molting sequence, and people say, well, who cares? Well, the molting sequence is critical
Mhm.
because they need to grow as quickly as possible and molt as fast as possible, because that offers them weatherproofing. It offers them the ability to get off the ground, to move faster. And so they need to grow feathers fast. And if you think about it, what does it take to grow feathers? Well, it takes insects to grow. It takes protein to make
Mhm.
feathers. And then you see, as broods get older, they expand their home range, and they use their behavior becomes much more plastic. And what I mean by that is they go from using very specific stuff to using a lot of different stuff. And it's because they can hop off the ground,
Mhm.
they can climb up on things, they can flush, prey towards one another, and they can really get aggressive with their foraging. And if you just watch a month-old brood, you can see how aggressive they are. They really get
Mhm.
after catching things, and they use communal behaviors to flush things and eat it, versus a small 10-day-old poult doesn't have that same ability. And if you think about it, okay, if you're hatched really late, like you're talking about, one, insect communities are not as diverse and abundant as they were back in May and June. And now you're trying to grow fast and molt quickly, but you don't have the same resources out there that those poults did 2 months earlier. And now you're in a situation where you're also competing with them behaviorally. You've got a stacked deck against you.
Mhm.
If you're hatched really, really late, the odds are tall that you're going to make it into a fall flock, because not only of the social constraints that are on you, but the environmental constraints
Mhm.
that you were hatched into just don't bode well for you. And if you, like right now, we're in a record drought here in Georgia. I mean, we haven't had measurable rainfall in 5 weeks.
Mhm.
And it's been like this, honestly, all summer. It's been extremely dry. And I go and walk around properties all the time, and it's tough. If you're a young poult in August, and right now in my part of the world, you had a tough go of it,
Mhm.
because insects were not easy to find,
Mhm.
even when I went looking for them.
Yeah, especially if you don't have a place that produces
Sure.
anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Well, it looks like, we're getting pretty short on time here. And one other thing that we wanted to cover, and I think, this kind of builds off what Marcus just asked a minute ago, is, what are the data gaps that you think that are important for us to address right now, both from academic perspective, as well as, what do you think any data gaps are that state agencies need to start looking into as we move forward with, continued discussion of the importance of season dates and turkey reproduction?
Yeah, one of the biggest things not all, but a lot of states lack is just good harvest rate data. They lack understanding what percentage of the tom population are we removing. And in a lot of states, at least in the South right now, you don't see that. If you look at game check data, we're not killing a lot of jakes anyway
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of states, but we're killing a lot of adults. But just saying we're killing a lot isn't helpful.
Mhm.
We need to know what percentage we're taking, and that requires capturing and banding, birds in the winter, and then getting band returns back year after year after year. And honestly, we agencies should have been doing this a decade ago, not starting now. But there are some states, like for instance, Louisiana's been banning birds for 30 years now, and their banding data sets very clearly show really high harvest rates on a lot of public lands, and even on some private lands, um, pretty high harvest rates. That's something agencies really need, because if we don't, and we don't know how many turkeys are out there. in the absence of that data, if we also don't know what percentage we're taking, then we're really hamstrung in regards to these changes that we're talking about. Well, if you don't know what percentage you were killing before, and you don't know what percentage you're killing after these changes are made, what do we use to make our decisions with? So I think that is something agencies really need to lend a keen eye to, and a lot of agencies are. I mean, I know Florida's banning birds. I know Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. I mean, there's a lot of states out there that are banning birds because they want that piece of data. So to me, that's a critical thing that we need.
Yeah, I think that's really important because, as states, just proactively, they're going to want to be, conservative with their season frameworks when they're experiencing a decline in that state, right? But if they have that good data, they may have to take some drastic measures with season frameworks at first. But if they find out that a result of those changes, maybe they limited opportunity a little bit more than they had to. But if they have the data that you're talking about, they could potentially make tweaks to that and maybe up the opportunity a little bit more again in a kind of an adaptive harvest management framework, right?
Yeah, for sure. So let's say they make a change and the harvest rate was 50% on public lands or 40%, and they made the change and it dropped to 15%.
Right.
And data suggested that maybe 20% was sustainable. Well, then maybe they could back off some of the changes and allow the data to drive the decision making, which the turkey world has not done a really good job of that.
The waterfowl folks have been doing this forever,
for decades. Yeah. Sure. And that model is out there, and I think but it takes data, and if you look at the waterfowl world, it takes decades of data to get to where they are, and we're behind. We need to catch up. But if nothing else, if we could figure out at a broad scale what percentage of these birds are we removing under these different harvest scenarios, then it would allow agencies to make sure they're balancing opportunity with sustainability. And that's where we all want to be. We all want a sustainable population that's doing well, and we want to be able to hunt that population, harvest birds, and do this thing that we cherish, which is spring turkey hunt.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about too. With just moving the season date, I guess people just assume that that's going to reduce harvest rate, but I think you said earlier you just change when a whole bunch of them are harvested, which could have implications for the bird. But also, if we're trying to reduce the number, you might have to have some sort of other commensurate approach, like moving the season. You're not going to necessarily, and even reducing the bag limit. A lot of people don't reach their bag limit anyway. So it's interesting. We may need a multifaceted approach if we truly need to reduce the the number. I guess some states have implemented other approaches, like you were saying, where you've changed the tools or when you can harvest the birds, if you're trying to string it out over a longer period of time. So there's other things that have been implemented, but I think it's important to think about, there's kind of two issues, I guess. One's the timing and intensity of the intensity, and the other one is just how many are being taken overall.
Yeah. And I think you'll continue to see states make changes, make tweaks, whether it be, okay, well, we changed the timing and that didn't really help us, so we're going to change the number, or the bag, or we're going to do, like we talked about, reducing harvest through seasons within a season, such as you can only kill one bird the first week, or whatever. You can't harvest jakes, so that we can hopefully recruit more into the I think you're going to see changes in a number of ways, trying to find that sweet spot. And to Will's point, and if we can just give a little bit up front, if we can find that sweet spot, and that sweet spot gives us some opportunity and flexibility back, then speaking personally, I'm willing to forego, up front, if the end is, a sustainable population that we can find what's the most appropriate harvest framework for this bird. I think we all have to be able to be flexible and give a little bit to see where that is.
Yeah. Well, and I haven't even thought about it, but it just I think that's part of the point. Like we change bag limits pretty commonly on ducks. So, if you had some sort of model where you were informing it, it could even be that we change how many gobblers you got every year based on productivity data from the state or whatever. So that's an interesting idea. And again, it wouldn't be very palatable up front, but people over time might be.
No change is palatable up front.
Right.
That's for sure. That's just the way we work.
But it's just like an accepted thing in the duck world that, a lot of people are duck hunters that are also turkey hunters. So, there may be a little more palatability there, but that's an interesting thought.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing that I've been thinking about too is, are we going to see the turkey conversation follow kind of the same lines as the deer conversation has over time, where we see, smaller spatial scale management of deer, where we have changes in season and bag limits based off of ownership or based off of area of the state and things like that, to see, more of a custom tailored harvest framework for turkeys over smaller spatial scales.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah, we're definitely doing it at more of a blunt instrument kind of scale with turkeys, it seems like. So where some places with deer, you're even county by county.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yep. For sure.
Well, Mike, we appreciate you coming on today. Is there anything else you'd like to mention or talk about before we go?
No, I think we've covered
a lot of ground.
We've covered a lot of ground. Yeah. I should have eaten before we got on. I know that.
Well, I should have gone to the bathroom, but that's too much information.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, for sure.
Well, for the audience that's not watching us out there, my lights have gone off 3 or 4 times in here.
You need to talk with your hands more, Marcus, to keep those sensors going.
I'm trying to not move because I don't want to hit anything or tear anything up. Mike, we really appreciate it, and I agree. We've covered a lot of great topics, and that's what we're trying to do on the podcast, is try to go into detail with folks like yourself that are really in tuned with wild turkey science and conducting a lot of that science. So we appreciate that, and I thought it was a great conversation. So hopefully all the audience agrees.
Yeah, I'm glad to participate. Not a problem, guys.
Yeah.
Good talking to you.
And we'd love to have you back on at some point in the future. One of the things we plan on doing going forward is, trying to run the circuit of all the turkey researchers throughout the U.S. right now and talk about what they've got going on in various states and what, their objectives are as parts of those studies. Because I think even in this information age, there's still a lot of hunters out there that aren't even aware of the work that's going on in their own state sometimes.
Oh, I completely agree.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I think people would really be interested if they knew how much work was actually ongoing and why.
Yeah.
Why are these projects being conducted, and what does it mean to you in your state or some other state, maybe, that's a destination state for you as a turkey hunter. I think that's certainly a worthy conversation to have.
Yeah, I think exactly that. That's the whole point, is we're trying to bring all of us together and get more information out. And that's ultimately, this is for turkeys. So we appreciate you being willing to come on and participate and providing, some perspective from your wealth of knowledge. And thing with the audience out there. I know I say it every time, but it's so important for us to be successful. We're trying to do our part. So help us out and, share this with your friends and rate it and all those things that help us push the information out to as many people as possible. Ultimately, like we've said, if we want to push the needle, we need to all get together on this and start doing the right thing at a bigger scale. So we all have our role in doing that.
No question.
Appreciate it, Mike.
Yep. Thank y'all.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
Take care.
Thanks everybody out there for listening to us. We really appreciate it.
Wild Turkey Science is sponsored by Turkeys for Tomorrow and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. For more information, follow us on social media linked in the show notes below.